I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for the day. I'm going to read his bio, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how we all have kind of come together in this fight in America. So Dr. James Lindsay is an American-born author, mathematician, and professional troublemaker. Dr. James Lindsay has written 6 books spanning a range of subjects, including religion, the philosophy of science, and postmodern theory. He is a leading expert on critical race theory, which leads him to reject it completely. He is the founder of New Discourses and currently promoting his new book, Cynical Theories: How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody, which is currently being translated into more than 15 languages. I invited James to come and speak today because one of the things that I think has been very interesting over the course of the last few years is that we have seen an expert class in America that we can no longer put our faith in. And that means that Americans really need to dig down deep in ourselves and use every tool in our toolbox to make the change that we want to see in our communities. Robin Steeman, the chapter chair here in Williamson County, exemplifies that. Robin was in the Air Force. She was a bomber pilot in the Air Force. And when I think about the work that Robin, yes, let's give Robin a round of applause for her service. And I was telling someone about Robin the other day and her experience, and they said, well, of course she has that background, because look what she's been able to do in her community. She has been bold, and she has been brave, and she has been willing to do something that many others were not sure how to do. She's willing to lead. Everyone has a role to play. If you're sitting here today and you're wondering what your role is, I want you to take a look inside yourselves and think about what makes you special and how you've been able to lead in your own lives and find a way to help America using those skills. Dr. Lindsay is an interesting man. He is rallying moms across America, teaching them about some of the history of our world that we may not have realized, and helping us to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes that have been made in the past. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. James Lindsay to the stage. You are in for a fascinating treat and a deep dive into what critical race theory looks like in the classroom and how we can work together to make sure that it doesn't define American education going forward. Thank you.
Hey, y'all. I'm home, kinda, so I can say I'm from Knoxville. I have the distinct privilege not just of getting to speak here with you, and thank you to Moms for Liberty, and thanks to Carol for inviting me, but I also have the distinct privilege of getting to speak all over the country, and this is the 3rd time I've had the opportunity to speak in Tennessee, and it's the best. It's simply the best, not to do that song. There's an energy here, and so what Tiffany just said, I wasn't planning on a speech that starts with what Tiffany just said, but what Tiffany just said is absolutely key. You all are here. You all are moms, teachers, parents, grandparents. You all are the key to sorting out this problem. And the energy in Tennessee, everywhere I've been across the country, in the 3 places I've now spoken in Tennessee, the energy in Tennessee means that Tennessee is going to be a leader. I would like to remind you, if you haven't heard it, since I didn't plan to do this, I'd like to remind you of the Tennessee State Constitution. We've talked a lot about the federal Constitution, but if you don't know, the Tennessee State Constitution is one of the most based constitutions in the United States of America. And Article 1 is our Bill of Rights. It has something like 36 of them. And Section 2 is the one I want to remind you of, given the context that we live in right now. And if I can do it from memory, we'll see how it goes. But as the government is instituted for the common benefit, the doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power shall be considered slavish, absurd, and to the destruction of the happiness and good of mankind. You must resist arbitrary power. Whatever that looks like, that's your charge as a Tennessean. You must resist arbitrary power on your children. I'm going to focus primarily on talking about education since Moms for Liberty invited me. But we're going to talk about critical race theory as well. The title of my talk, I messed up. It's titled Critical Race Theory and the Future of America. It should be titled Critical Race Theory or the future of America. Because it's actually that simple. I'll give you the simplest definition. It's getting a little trite to say this, that apparently nobody can define critical race theory. I'll give you the simplest definition of critical race theory that you can possibly hold. You think I'm going to say, oh, it's race Marxism, which is pretty simple. It's 2 words, and it's correct. But no, it is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. That's what critical race theory is. It is calling whatever you want to control racist until you control it. That's not American. That's arbitrary power. You must resist arbitrary power. Calling something racist is not a basis for getting to control it. And that's what the entire game is. Why? Because it is race Marxism. It is Marxism using race. But why is it so critical to understand that critical race theory, there's no such thing as critical race theory and the future of America. It is or the future of America. Why is it that existential? Well, I like to do this. I've read this a few times to audiences. I like to read directly from the people I'm criticizing so you know what they actually say. That way I don't have to paraphrase or pretend I memorized part of the Constitution. So a couple of years ago, in 2019, a very famous critical race theorist by the name of Ibram Kendi was asked by Politico magazine to answer a simple question: how do you fix inequality? Of course, Dr. Kendi, just be plain, is not the sharpest tool in the shed. But his answer is very telling, and you're going to see immediately that's an example of exactly what I was just saying. He says, to fix inequality, we must pass an anti-racist constitutional amendment. Pass an anti-racist constitutional amendment. The Constitution is the first and the last law of this country. Fully amended, I should say. So if we add an anti-racist constitutional amendment, all other law is subject to what that amendment contains. And so we'll read Dr. Kendi's brilliant words. To fix the original sin of racism, Americans should pass an anti-racist amendment to the U.S. Constitution that enshrines 2 guiding anti-racist principles. Just for posterity, he misspelled principles. And Politico didn't catch it. They got great fact checkers in the media. What are these 2 principles? 1, racial inequity is evidence of racist policy. And 2, the different racial groups are equals. Now let me linger on that first one. I said that critical race theory is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. Racial inequity is evidence of racist policy, is Dr. Kendi's core principle for this constitutional amendment. What does that mean? Inequity means that there are differences in outcomes on average by group. That's inequity. So if you see unequal outcomes on average by group, according to the Constitution, should he get his way, that will be called racist. And unless you think I'm making it up, his goal is to control everything that can be called racist by this definition. He goes on. I promise this is only 1 paragraph. The amendment would make unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold, as well as racist ideas by public officials. Racist ideas would become unconstitutional. A little bit of a contradiction to that First Amendment. It would establish and permanently fund the Department of Anti-Racism. I, again, kid you not, DOA. The DOA, I mean, come on. And what would this Department of Anti-Racism do? It is going to be comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees, he tells us. What is a formally trained expert on racism? A critical race theorist. That's what it is. The DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield racial inequity, monitor those policies, investigate private racist policies when racial inequity surfaces, and monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. That's a dictatorship. Absolute authority over the contents of your head, absolute authority over federal law, state law, local law, and private industry policy. That is a totalitarian dictatorship to be run by critical race theorists. It's critical race theory or the future of America. He closes by saying the DOA would be empowered with the disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policies and ideas. This is a dictatorship of the anti-racists. The parallel, since we all know that this is Marxist, is the dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx wanted to see come in to seize the means of production. The idea was going to be that you're going to awaken a class consciousness in the working class. You're going to make them resent the property holders. You're going to awaken that resentment. You're going to awaken a kind of solidarity across all working class workers. Workers of the world unite. And they are going to rise up and seize the means of production and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat that will enforce equity in the name of socialism upon the populace. Until when? Until the populace breaks and it becomes spontaneous. I say the populace breaks, but the truth is that their claim is, the truth is that the population breaks. What they say is that the population would become socialized, as we heard earlier, to see that this is the better way, that this is the way forward. When this becomes spontaneous, you have, finally, the utopia called communism. In critical race theory, it is that you're going to have a Department of Anti-Racism that's going to be a dictatorship of the anti-racists that does not enforce socialism, it enforces equity, which means socialism, but with cultural products, not just material products. And in the end, if you do this long enough and you break the population and it becomes spontaneous, you get what? That thing that has never happened before, that we heard, say, after St. Floyd died. Justice. You get racial justice. The communists have repurposed the word justice to mean communism. It's a bit of a problem. So this is why I keep saying that I mistitled this talk. It is critical race theory or the future of America. Now, I've described to you already that we are dealing with race Marxism. I've said enough to convince you, I think. I could go through Marx's historicism and compare it to what critical race theory sees as the trajectory of history. You'd see it's the same. I could talk about the way that Marx viewed the ideologists, who are the people who get to work within what he called the superstructure of society that shapes society for the bourgeoisie and its own benefit. They create these justifications called ideology for why they get to have a job and why they're not workers with a hammer and a sickle. And I could tell you that the ideology that they have said within the superstructure of whiteness and critical race theory is white supremacy, and that it creates a structural racism throughout our society. And you would say, wow, that is just Marxism. It's really simple. It is Marxism using race instead of class, or in the words of Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is an education critical race theorist, who wrote a paper in 1995 called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education, because it's not in our schools. She said the point of critical race theory is to make race the central construct for understanding inequality instead of class. It's Marxism repurposed using race instead of class. So what you need to understand, though, because Marxism's not popular. Marxism, especially in the United States, has a long history of failure, a long history of murder, a long history of genocide, catastrophe, and death, a long history of destroying nations. Marxism's not popular. So the question isn't, are they trying to install Marxism? That's obvious. Yes, they are. The question is, how are they trying to install Marxism? And I don't mean, by using race instead of class. It's too abstract. How are they managing it? And one thing you've already heard, they just changed the words. We won't call it communism, we'll call it justice. So St. Floyd dies. We have the guy eventually, Derek Chauvin, gets convicted on 3 counts. by the justice system, and we have major Democratic politicians taking to the airwaves within 10 minutes saying this is not justice, it's merely accountability. Justice is a lot more work down the road. And then we have the vice president telling us that the work is every day. Just the other day. The work is communism. The work is communism. So the question is, how on earth, besides tricky language, which we're all starting to see through now, besides tricky language, how on earth are they doing this? And the answer, we've already heard here today as well, has a lot to do with the schools. You've probably heard of the Long March Through the Institutions. This is a Marxist plan that was hatched in the 60s, where a German Marxist by the name of Rudi Dutschke looked at what Mao Zedong had achieved in China, and he also read what the cultural Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci had written. And he said, this is how you infiltrate the institutions. And the most important institution to infiltrate is education. Mao knew this. Gramsci knew it too. Gramsci said there are 5 cultural pillars you have to infiltrate and culturally change from within to Marxism if you want to overturn a Western society. Those are religion, it's definitely happening there, family, we all feel it, education, media, and law. We could add healthcare to that now for sure. Education works differently than the others. This isn't like a table with 5 legs. It's one of those tables that has 4 legs that come up in a V off of a single thing. And education's the pillar that holds them all up. Why? Where do you get your pastors? They go to seminary. Where do you get your doctors? They go to medical school. Where do you get your lawyers? They go to law school. Where do you get your teachers? They go to teaching college. Where do you get your media personalities? They study communications. They go to college. Education is the key. You get a couple of generations of students, and they're going to demand that the universities bend to their will while the universities are pumping this stuff into them at the same time. And you have this kind of perfect storm, kind of a revolving circle where you have it being grassroots underneath by the students demanded, top down, pressed down from the administration, applied, and from the faculty applied, and you can change the institutions from within. The neo-Marxists of the 1970s were very unpopular. The New Left, they called them. They were violent. They blew things up. People didn't like them. So what did they do? They gave up their life of crime and went into K through 12 activism, primarily. And they explicitly and intentionally started going into the teaching colleges. They call this the critical turn in education. And they infiltrated our education system with the intent, and this is in their own words, of becoming like viruses that would infect other disciplines. They say that their perfect, ideal metaphor for themselves is a virus. They compare themselves favorably to HIV, Ebola, and AIDS. Especially AIDS, because it suppresses the immune system, which they identify with conservatives. Needs to be suppressed. They say that the virus is the perfect metaphor. You train these kids in college, maybe they study journalism, maybe they study media, and then you send them out into the world to infect the institution in the real world. So you can take over a society by changing its institutions, and you can take over its institutions by changing education, while dismantling the family, while dismantling faith, which are huge, huge cultural bulwarks that stop this kind of thing from taking over. So how are you going to do that? Well, you use the schools, and this is what I really want to communicate to you. We're going to use a metaphor that's maybe a little uncomfortable given the pandemic, past tense pandemic. It lasted for 15 days. They told us that from the beginning. We're on day like 666 of that or something. That was a couple weeks ago, to be honest, but the metaphor I want to use is of an injection. And this is where we're going to turn our attention to the schools, although there are other things. This is all happening in healthcare as well. Racism, the T.H. Chan School of Public Health, which was paid for by CCP money through an individual named Ronnie Chan, if we're going to name names. The T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard, by the way, was bought by a Chinese national at the tune of $500 million a few years ago. Harvard Crimson reported on it. Freshmen at Harvard wrote this story. Nobody paid attention. T.H. Chan School said that racism is a public health threat. It is the key public health threat. We have states that are determining who can have monoclonal antibodies and not based on their race. It's one of many factors. That's how they get around it. They put in many factors. They give you an overall composite score. But they're just denying people based on race certain treatments. They wanted to prioritize the vaccine, which is a little bit funny given all the other things they yell about. Make black and brown people take the experimental vaccine first. I mean, seriously. These people are stupid. But what I want to say is that you have a syringe with a poison in it. In critical race theory, you think I'm going to say is the poison. It's not. It wouldn't work. It's not. America's too strong for that. As weak as we can be to racism, as inflamed as we can get around race, we're too strong for that. It doesn't work. We're looking at not just Marxism, but Maoism. Mao Zedong is the model. And it worked in China. And here's how it works. There are two poisons, or two injections if you want. There are two poisons in that syringe. They are critical race theory and queer theory. And they work in tandem. The name of the syringe in your school is social emotional learning. Social emotional learning works like this. We'll come back to queer theory in a minute, I promise. Everybody's on tenterhooks about that. Social emotional learning works like this. We're going to pretend that school teachers are psychologists. We're now going to let them practice unlicensed psychiatry in classrooms, which are unregulated settings, on children in a group, often by doing things that make them vulnerable, that make them uncomfortable, and then that will give them a way out of that vulnerability and discomfort by telling them the right answers to how they're supposed to feel about things. There's your emotional learning. How they're supposed to interact with one another. There's your social learning, which has another name, which is socialization. And socialization is the project that Marx said makes man turn to social man, which is short for socialist man, who is a man who cannot live outside of a socialist system. That's what you do. That's the social part of social emotional learning. Now, I don't want to crap on the whole of social emotional learning. We have to be very careful because we'll have something thrown back in our faces. Social emotional learning started out to help troubled children who really were troubled children, and it had resounding success when it was applied by psychologists in one-on-one settings with troubled children who had learning issues, problems at home, etc. So they have also, unfortunately for us, a mountain of data saying, wow, it works. They have no data saying that it works when you start applying it broad brush to everybody by unqualified teachers. 6 weeks course or whatever on a Zoom doesn't make you a psychologist. In a unregulated, non-therapeutic space, in a group setting that works out to doing an awful lot of shaming. You get people to talk about their bodies and what they're uncomfortable with. This is where the queer theory. You start telling them about, maybe you're not sure about if you're a boy or a girl. Here's the queer theory again. You get them uncomfortable. This is blatant cult indoctrination 101. If you don't know how to indoctrinate somebody into a cult, let me tell you. Listen to me. No, I'm kidding. Everybody, when I snap, no, I'm kidding. The way you indoctrinate somebody into a cult is you induce or inflame a sense of fear or vulnerability, emotional vulnerability, and then you give them a pathway out of that fear or vulnerability through the accepted doctrine of the cult. Does it sound like what you listen to on CNN with all these variants? It's called fear cycling. It's a psyops. It works there too. But what they do in the school is they get these kids vulnerable. And here's what Mao Zedong did, so I can compare it back to Mao. Because Maoism is the tool that makes a cultural revolution work. And a cultural revolution is what opens the door to Marxism in a Western country. And here's what you do. Mao Zedong separated. He created 10 identities for Chinese kids. 5 of them were black identities. Those were bad. 5 of them were red for communism. Those were good. The black identities were things like landlord, rich farmer, counter-revolutionary, bad influence, things like that. The red identities were Marxists, revolutionaries, people from the Red Guard, etc. Peasants, day laborers, because it was the working class. Now imagine this. Now imagine you take something like critical race theory. You've got the syringe of social emotional learning. So you break kids down, cult indoctrination style, psychologically open them up, vulnerability, and then you tell them the way that you actually make them vulnerable is you start talking about their most personal stuff, their identity. And you tell them, maybe you don't feel like wearing a suit and jacket. Maybe you want to wear a dress. Are you a boy or a girl? That's the queer theory side. Or you tell them, this country was founded on white racism. And it's never really gone away. Did you know, by the way, that critical race theorists don't think we've had any racial progress? And as a matter of fact, they think it's gone backwards. They actually believe that racism has got worse, not better, because it's less visible. It used to be really easy to see. Now it's just the same as during slavery. But nobody can see it because everybody hides it so well behind what they call a racial contract that nobody ever talks about, nobody ever mentions, but we all sign up to. Sounds like a conspiracy theory. So there's these races like white people who have all this racial generational guilt. So your white kids start feeling real vulnerable. I'm the worst kind of person. I remember reading that from a 7-year-old. The story was he got in his mom's car after school, picked up, he's all bummed out. What's wrong, buddy? I'm the worst kind of person. Well, what do you mean? I'm white. You make them vulnerable. You create a black identity in Maoist terms. White, straight, male, cisgender, etc. There's like 50 of them. Mentally well, as opposed to mentally ill. Black identity. And then you say, well, you know what? You can become an ally. That's a red identity, racial ally. You could transition. You could be non-binary. You could be bisexual. Those are all protected minority classes. Those are red identities. You could do the work, become a revolutionary. Red identity. You could basically become the critical race and queer theory equivalent of an identity-based activist, an identity Marxist activist. That is a red identity. You could do the right thing and protect your family and get vaccinated. Red identity, instead of the dirty black identity of unvaccinated. Who has to wear a mask? Who has to be doused in hand sanitizer? I actually got an email from a woman this morning from Vermont who told me that her child, she's seeing what they're doing through the social emotional learning and how they're using these tools to break her child down socially and emotionally and tell them what the right emotional responses are. And she told me, in no uncertain terms, I would rather they hit my child than break him down psychologically. And so what you're doing then is you give, especially these young white girls, no positive possibility of an identity unless they transition. And we see a massive, massive, massive spike, 4,000+% if I'm not mistaken, in young women, girls, transitioning, 13-year-olds trying to sign up for double mastectomies so they can get their red identity. Now, when we get to queer theory, though, I have to elucidate something to you, because now you see, I've got a bunch of mixed metaphors here, but you see how the two poisons work together. Another way you can see it is we got one monster, and it's kind of shadowy. We don't know for sure what we're fighting. We know it's Marxist, and we can see its left hand is queer theory and its right hand is critical race theory. So you deck them with critical race theory, and you make them feel bad about who they happen to be as a person, what their skin color is, who their parents and grandparents were, and what they might or might not even have done. I got a guy I'm friends with, his parents immigrated from France in the 1950s, and he gets called a descendant of slaveholders all the time. It's just made up. So you bludgeon them with the one hand, and then you give them the way out with the other. And you break them down psychologically so that they feel like they have to do it to have any self-worth. That's the Maoist program that's happening in our schools under the brand name of social emotional learning, which used to be great and has been co-opted by the Marxists. I was told I couldn't swear unless I used communist exactly after by the fucking communists. I didn't do it. That's how this works. That's how this works. And you do one generation of kids after another generation of kids after another generation of kids, like we heard from the pastor earlier. You do that one after another, and they think that's how it is. And we keep hearing the word indoctrination with this. And what you're going to realize real quick, this is not indoctrination. This is much worse than indoctrination. Because what's a doctrine? This is programming. This is programming. And for you older folks, reprogramming, or as they called it in the old days, re-education. This is Soviet. This is what it is. This is how it works. This is what we're up against in our schools. And so you see, you got this left hand and this right hand. So what is this with queer theory, though? Because you think, well, we should be kind. I know this is a very biblical room, and it can go either way with this. We should be very kind. We should be very accepting of LGBT identities and whatever people are, whatever. Okay, let's grant that. There's a paper. I read it on my podcast. It's called something about queer futurity in childhood development. What it means to grow up, what your future look like if you grow up queer. And it talks about queer theory. It's written by a queer theorist named Hannah Dyer. 96, I think, is when the paper was published. And it explains that queer theory is not about it says this explicitly, queer theory is not about creating a stable LGBTQ identity. That's antithetical to queer theory. I know many people who from the 80s and 90s even were fighting for gay equality, a real civil rights movement in this society. And you know what they say? If I had to be queer, I never would have come out. That's an exact quote from one. A very famous one, but I won't name him just in case he doesn't want to be named. Queer theory is not about creating a stable LGBT, I won't even say Q, identity. It is about creating an unstable identity. It is, by definition, the definition of queer in queer theory is an identity without an essence. That's what they want your child to have. They want either racial grievance or an identity without an essence or some combination thereof. This is a mentally disordered child that they are producing. And why? Because they're manipulable. Same reason that they can't read or write for themselves, because then they have to be told what the right answers are. They have to be told how you're supposed to act. They have to be told what their emotional response is supposed to be. They have to be told what being a good social man looks like. And who's going to put themselves in the position of telling? Formally trained experts in racism is the term of the realm. Critical race theorists, queer theorists, identity communists. And they're doing it to manipulate your children. The goal is not to create stable identities, it's to create the inability to know who you are. Queer theory more than any of the others, but all of these critical theories of identity are an acid meant to dissolve you and your society. Why? Let's circle back to Mr. Gramsci. Why would you do this, Mao Zedong? Why would you use social emotional learning, Chairman? Well, because those two last pillars, it's easy to infiltrate media. Look at that. Turns out to be a little harder to infiltrate law, but not impossible. Justice Sotomayor. Turns out not to be terribly hard even to infiltrate education, at least when conservatives decide to cede education for 50 years to leftists. Just give up on that project, let them have it. Turns out not to be that hard to infiltrate those. Harder to infiltrate faith. Harder to infiltrate the family. Now here's a couple of points. Imagine that you've got a child filled with racial resentment and confusion, with an identity without an essence. Not real positive about the country that he's been raised in. Thinks he's any number of different sexual, gender, and romantic identities. If you didn't know, by the way, there are, not just are there sexual identities, there are romantic identities. They have to make it more complicated. You can be demisexual and lithromantic at the same time while having a xenogender. A xenogender, by the way, is a gender that is alien to the concept of gender, like tree or dragon or nebula or sun or solar system or universe as your gender. Demisexual means being a healthy woman. It means that you're only sexually attracted to people that you're in love with. I forgot what lith means. It's on my website. You can look up. I forgot. So they come home. You're, what do we say? Lithromantic, demisexual, xenogender tree kid with pronouns tree self. Comes home and is trying to relate. It says some of this. Like, what did you learn at school today, Johnny? I learned that I'm a demisexual, lithromantic, tree gender with pronouns tree self. Mom, grandma, and dad sitting there for a minute like, what? What's Johnny say? Just kidding, he goes by Lavender now. It's like a tree, but not really, and they get things wrong. It's a plant, it's a joke. So what he says is, you don't understand. You come from a different generation, a different time. You don't know what it's like to be me now. You don't even know what these words mean. You don't know who I am. And the institution of the family gets hit with lightning. And then you say, no. God created man and woman, made them companions. And they say, that's old stuff. The Bible doesn't apply to us anymore. And then you've infiltrated the institution of faith. You get the children to reject both family and faith by giving them identities that both family and faith don't know what to do with. They don't know. There are a lot of things in the Bible. It's supposed to cover all things. Lithsexual ain't in there. It ain't in there because it's made up. It's a Marxist indoctrination tool following through the sexual revolution crap that started with George Lukács, who's a Hungarian sadist who was huge in the Bela Kun regime that didn't last very long in Hungary when it went communist in 1919. That's where that all started. It's a communist plot. Why? Why did George Lukács do that? Because he knew it would destroy the family and faith. That's what this is about. Mao called it destroying the four olds, Suzhou in Mandarin. The four olds were old customs, old habits, old culture, old ways of thinking. They had to be destroyed. I've had the privilege of going to Beijing a number of times, and I've visited the Lama Temple, which is one of the few places left in Beijing that has artifacts older than 1950. Has 900,000-year-old, 1,100-year-old artifacts still. Because these students hopped up on their red and black identities, went and started tearing down statues, raiding temples and destroying everything in them, tearing down all of the old culture, old customs, old habits, and old ways of thinking. This also involved beating up their parents and grandparents, sometimes to death, and their teachers, who had black identities given to them by some government official who wanted them beat to death. This is the road that we are on. Social emotional learning is the name of the syringe. Our red and black identities are defined in terms of things like critical race theory and queer theory. And that's how they are programming our children to understand the world, our country, and themselves, and you. On faith, by the way, there's also, if you don't know this, there's also direct infiltration. A lot of people will have heard, I don't know how many Southern Baptists we got up in here, but in 2019 in April at the Southern Baptist National Convention, they passed what was called Resolution 9 under very shady circumstances. Resolution 9 said they were going to bring critical race theory and intersectionality as an analytical tool subordinate to Scripture. How many of y'all think that critical race theory is designed to stay subordinate to anything? It is literally an ideology predicated on the idea that anything that subordinates is evil and must be overthrown and replaced with itself. That's its whole idea as an analytical tool. So it's going to be subordinate to Scripture, not for long. And the fearless leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention, under very shady circumstances, namely there were 13 resolutions on the table that year. They had lots of time to discuss resolutions 1 through 8. Whoops, we ran out of time. Oh no, resolutions 9 through 13 voted on in a single block, no discussion. I know, I saw the video. I'm actually in a documentary about it. Very, very shady circumstances. So they bring this in, subordinate to Scripture. No, to subordinate Scripture. In the Southern Baptist Convention, which has some umpteen million people involved in it and $80 billion. It's actually if it were a country, the Southern Baptist Convention is a larger country, both in economics and population, than Australia, which is also communist now. So now you get a real picture of what's going on here. The goal is to subvert the key institutions that keep America going, that keep the American dream alive. The tool primarily is in education through social emotional learning, injecting critical race theory and queer theory poison into kids so that they interact in a way that replicates, literally, Mao Zedong's injection of Leninist Marxism or Bolshevism into China, which worked. Might have killed 100 million people between 1966 and 1976 in the process, or thereabouts. Nobody knows how many. China's not in great shape these days. We see it as this big, giant world power, but that's because it opened its markets and stopped being communist, in full tilt anyway. It's in bad shape as it is anyway, because when you're communist, even when you have open markets, you lie about everything, and now their housing market bubble is exploding. I've been told that they're likely to lose over $7 trillion in asset value in the next 12 months, possibly. I don't know if that will actually occur, but that's the scale of the depression that they're headed for all their lies. And we're doing this to ourselves now here. And so what are we going to do? What can we do? And the answer is to look at what they said the plan is and do it backwards. They said we're going to dismantle faith. We're going to separate one generation from the next, both in terms of family and faith. So you're like, no, we're going to start mentoring children. I keep hearing the word disciple. Now, I mean, personally, I don't even believe in God, but I think you should disciple your children. I think that we should have robust faith. I think that everybody has the private conscience that they have, and they have an inalienable right to the contents of that conscience, and the government doesn't get to impose a state woke religion into it. I think that the Southern Baptist Convention has no business, or the Marxist Pope has no business, or the PCA has no business coming in and changing one faith after another, after another, after another, so that it sounds like Catholicism, or it sounds like Southern Baptist, or it sounds like Presbyterianism, or it sounds like Islam, or it sounds like Buddhism, or it sounds like Judaism, but it professes social justice, which, remember, socialist justice means communism. A bunch of fake faiths preaching some other one. Now with the United States of America's federal government's backing against the key provision of the First Amendment, which all of these other life, liberty, pursuit of happiness things we want to talk about. Religious liberty was the reason this country was founded. There is a reason 1620 was the year of the Pilgrims' Pride. They were pilgrims because they were Calvinists, and Europe had had enough of them. We're like, get out. You have no quarter here. And they said, let's go found a country where we're not going to do that to people. So even if you want to be a communist, you have the right to your religion in this country. But it doesn't mean it has to be given access to power. So you have to remove these people from the levers of power. You have to take their school board seats. You have to take their county commission seats. You have to take their state house seats. You have to primary every person, not just who espouses these ideas, Democrat or Republican, but who isn't willing to stand up to them. That's something. You have to, again, like I said, we have to reinstall those social institutions. You need to connect across generations. We need healthy schools that do that. We need healthy churches that do that. We need healthy families that do that. We need to gear policy where public policy matters to making sure that it doesn't get in the way of having healthy families and healthy schools and robust churches that can raise up a new generation one after another. We have to protect these institutions. We have to continue to let alternative medias flourish, because the flame of truth will burn down any box it's put in. CNN can't hold back the truth forever. We see it happening around us. We have a second enlightenment coming. We're well into it, and we're now seeing the last grasp of the old power structure turning to Marxism as its desperate attempt, teaming up with Marxism, I should say. The Marxists always wanted it. Now you have the companies, the corporations wanting it. Why? What happened to the capitalists? They know they're about to be deposed, and they want to shut you up and stop you from being able to speak and stop you from being able to meet through a social credit system and a broad social media censorship campaign so that they can't be exposed as frauds, liars, and criminals and removed from power. That's what it all boils down to. So you have to resist that by doing exactly what they don't want you to do. That's all it takes. But we heard last night from Dr. Carson, and he said that we already have this he said the diversity is our strength in this country. I want to tell you, we hear about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, we already know that equity means socialism, but I'm going to give it a handful of credit for a second, and I'm going to use the lie that they use in truth. They say that equity is not about equal outcomes, it's about equal access. So we'll take them at their lie. It's not for them. They measure whether access was equal by if the outcomes were equal, so they lie. But if it really is about equal access, let's grant the word. We, in the United States of America, already have the best diversity, equity, and inclusion program this world has ever come up with. In Latin, it's e pluribus unum. From many, one. In the Declaration of Independence, it's that we are all created equal and granted certain inalienable rights, among them the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Our Constitution and Bill of Rights were written to preserve that in the people, not in the government. The government, by the way, doesn't have free speech to use critical race theory on your kids. That's another lie. We have more diversity in this country because this country has always welcomed it. And because you come here, you become a citizen, and you are as American as every other American. In my experience, a lot of fully legal immigrants in this country are more American than almost anybody. They're wearing like America suits, flying America flags, like shooting off fireworks on any given Tuesday. Because they love this country and they know what it represents. They know what they can build here. We heard that from Dr. Carson. I don't have to go over it again. We already have diversity, and our diversity is our strength, and our unity comes in the fact that we recognize that we are many different people who have come together as one. So we remember that founding principle, e pluribus unum. We have equality of access. That's the American dream that we are keeping alive. We didn't always, and that promissory note that Dr. King spoke about was meant to be fulfilled, and we had a civil rights movement, and we threw off those specters of the past to the best of our ability, and we have been moving forward rapidly ever since. Not to say everything's perfect, but it doesn't need to be. It's a project, and we're in it together. We already have the best diversity and equity. And inclusion, same thing. We're just getting redundant at this point. You want to be an American? Become a citizen. Welcome. You're included. Get a job. The American dream is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the thing they're selling us as diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether it's in schools, whether it's in corporations, or whether it's in faith, is a fraud. It is a simulacrum of the real thing. It is a fake, a phony, and it should actually be prosecuted under consumer protection laws as such. It does not even deliver the goods. You could say we did the experiment, and does it make things better? No, it makes things worse. Everywhere it's installed, the data aren't equivocal. Companies are falling apart. Internal corporate culture is a catastrophe. I just read this horrendous thread about what it's like to work in a tech company now. And it's all just feelings, and nobody doing their job. It's constant identity this, identity that, people getting told about their identity, and then all of a sudden somebody comes out as gay. We have to have a gay sensitivity meeting. Now everybody in the office for 3 months comes and says, what's your sex life like? Great hostile working environment it creates. It's a catastrophe. So we even did the experiment. We gave them the benefit of the doubt, and they failed the test. It's a fraud. So it should be prosecuted as such, attorneys general. As for you, if you're not an attorney general, what can you do? Proclaim these values of the United States. Bring them to the next generation. Connect with that generation and show them, like we heard from CJ this morning. Remind them and yourself, how much is at stake? CJ told us, at 19 years old, he said, how much stake he has in this country succeeding. And he's right. And he's 19, which means there's 18 years younger than him. And they are at stake too. So you've got to stand up. You've got to fight. You've got to find your role in this fight, and you need to take it up. And keep principle at the center of that. E pluribus unum. All men are created equal. And if you are of faith, your faith. That's what I've got to say to you. Thank you.